because there's a specific pattern with God that God's always done. And I believe that we're in that pattern now. So here we go. Is ready? You make your own decision, right? It's not like, Saul is Saul, Paul is Paul. It's got to always be there. I'm not saying don't ever read Paul. Actually, you can read a lot of Paul, and it's seen through the lens of history and, historical context and the ancient Jewish traditions and their worldview and the supernatural worldview. It's actually really interesting. I caution people to just read Paul as the Christian church reads Paul and doesn't give you the context, okay? We'll get to context as one of the greatest defenses that Christians will give as to why Paul is so important. And they'll come to defense and say, well, it's the context. And we're going to talk about that soon. And remember, they're looking at it from a dispensational view, which means they truly believe that God deals with different people in different ways and that he's going to deal with all people, right? The Christian church in all denominations, whether it's Catholic, Orthodox, and all the Protestant religions. That's Christianity. And all of that is going to be dealt with totally different than God's ever dealt with his people before. I don't buy into dispensationalism. I think that's a crock because I believe God doesn't change. So remember that, the subtleties of that. There's a lot more there than let's read Paul every day, and that's what it is. So I'm trying to get you into those subtleties. You may come up with the same ending that I did, where I straight up accuse this fucker of being the Antichrist, or you may fit somewhere, or you may think, no, he's great, you're crazy, or you could be somewhere in the middle. Either way, I hope this at least opens your eyes, opens your mind a little, and gives you a different perspective on how to receive the preachings of Paul. So let's go. And just don't take everything for granted. Don't take things for granted just because the preacher said so. Because they ain't telling you this. So I am. And I love you. And I hope you receive it with an open mind. Okay. So Saul of Tarsus. Let's roll. My position, you can see I put a picture of Jesus with like the false Christ behind him, right? And then I've got with the horns, that's the enemy. That's how I'm seeing Saul. It's the guy standing behind Jesus going, yeah, watch this. Saint Paul, the next picture, is how everyone else sees Paul in the church because he's the founder of the church, right? Moving right along, which is it? Why don't we all just start with who the heck is Saul? I call him Saul because, and yes, that's a bias. His name is Saul or Shaul, which is a nod to his Jewish lineage and his original name because he was a Hebrew. Paul is his Greekized or Romanized name, right, that he would use at different times. So because, the Greco-Roman church is in Greco-Roman society is the one that built on Paul, they call him Paul. Well, I think he's the Antichrist from the Hebrew scriptures. So I'm going to stick to his Hebrew name and I call him Saul. And there's a lot of, there's a lot of taint that goes with the name Saul. And that goes all the way back to King David, who was constantly at odds and battling with King Saul of those times. King Saul, who gave David so much fucking trouble. So there's that connotation. And we'll get into that later. But so I do call him Saul. Everybody else calls him Paul because he had two names. He gave himself two names. So here we go. It's just one version of the other. The Hebrew version, it's like Jesus and Yeshua, right? It's the same thing. Same name, two different versions. One is Romanized. All right, so who is this guy? Well, he was born in Tarsus. This is kind of like Athens, if you will, meaning it wasn't like this little dinky-ass village. It was a pretty metropolitan city, okay? It was the capital of the region that he lived in, and so it wasn't quite as big as Athens, but I want you to think that way. Like this was a bustling, thriving city with its own economy and all of the art and the music and the thinkers and the philosophers and the poets and all that's happening and the parties, right? So he's a city boy. And Tarsus is in an area of Turkey. You can see my little map here. We've got Italy, the boot, right? There's our boot that we were always taught as kids. And if you jump over, here's Greece. And then we go into the area of Turkey. Well, this is right here in southern Turkey. That's right next to the Levant, where all the good stuff starts happening. We've got Damascus and Syria and Lebanon and Israel, and all of that stuff starts to go there. And this is, you're staring at the Mediterranean Sea. He's from the tribe of Benjamin. And there's a certain curse that exists on the tribe of Benjamin. So we're not going there today. We likely will at some point. But right now, just know that he's from the tribe of Benjamin, and there is a curse on the tribe of Benjamin as being ungodly. So we just put a pin in that. We'll get back to them later. The quote is, if you want to look it up and kind of go off on your own little tangent about the different tribes, the tribe of Benjamin is, from you will come ravenous wolves. And that comes the wolf in sheep's clothing thing and all of that connotation. We're not teaching on that today, but it's important. So just stick a pin in that. We'll come back to the tribe of Benjamin. All right. He's absolutely named from and in the bloodline of King Saul. And King Saul was the one who loved God and then turned his back on God and became the psychopathic, wicked, evil fucker and chased David around. That when David was always running, right? He was always running from King Saul. That's part of the issue. Like most of David's life was dealing with King Saul. Like for like 13 years, I think he hunted him down. It was something crazy. So a lot of David's Psalms. So, I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. That's him in this valley where literally King Saul was right there and his men were after him. This wasn't some metaphorical thing. It can be, but it was a literal place where King Saul was literally chasing King David all over the place. All right, so this guy comes from the DNA and the bloodline of the ravenous wolves of Benjamin, from and named after King Saul, who gave King David so much trouble. And King David's bloodline is the DNA bloodline where Jesus came from. So there's a bloodline thing happening here. Just saying. He went from really passionate about God to a murderous lunatic, and that's who Saul is, and that's his legacy. Saul of Tarsus, but the Saul Paul now, where the church's teachings are built upon, his family, they were wealthy. They're what you call privileged these days. They were landowners, which is huge. And they were landowners in the Roman Empire because Turkey's part of the Roman Empire. But they owned this land in Tarsus before his family line, right? His generations, his grandparents, whatever, owned this land in Rome or in Turkey before Rome came in and conquered it and took it as their land. Rome came in, had this whole area under their charge, but Paul's family owned the land before Rome came in. And there's special rights and privileges granted to families who pre-owned land before the Romans came in. And this was one of the Romans' ways of expanding their territory and not having people fighting back too hard, like they still fought back. But they gave perks to some of the wealthier families and landowners. So it's really important that they owned it before Rome took Turkey. What are some of those perks that he got? Well, he was able to be a Roman citizen. That's huge. He had Roman citizenship simply on the fact that he was a landowner, and all that comes with being a Roman citizen was huge. Okay. And he was also able to keep his Jewish heritage. So he clung to his Jewish heritage, sort of. I don't like the word clung because I don't really think he did, but he identified as with his Jewish ethnicity. and heritage and traditions, if you will, while also living in Rome and being a Roman secular citizen. So he's kind of got this dual identity, if you will. And that's where we get the two names, Saul with the Hebrew stuff and Paul with the Roman stuff, which is exactly the problem with Paul. That's the crux of the issue with Paul. Who does he really serve? Secular pagan Romans and Greeks or the Jews? Where does is he a double agent? Like, this is where we get into the double agent Saul Paul stuff because of his two identities. And that's really important. He was fluent in both the common language under the Roman Empire at the time, which was the Greek, and he was able to read and do its things in the Hebrew. So he's still got feet in both camps in language wise. Now, Paul is an interesting figure. Paul lovers will take this dual identity, right, of the pagan Rome and the Hebrew ethnicity and background and tradition. And they'll take those two and spin it to the positive or spin it to the negative, depending on how you feel about Paul. So lots of people say, well, he polluted Jesus's words to make it more appetizing to the pagans. So he gutted a bunch of shit, because if he didn't gut all the Hebrew stuff, the pagans never would have accepted Jesus's words. So he was sort of like, and that's okay, because he didn't really twist Jesus's words. He just said it different because he understood the mindset and of the pagans and what they would hear. So he preached the true gospel. He just sounds different because he's talking to the pagans and not to the Jews. And then when he goes and he's talking to the Hebrews, well, now he sounds different because he's speaking in a way that they'll understand. So this is actually a strength of Paul. Like a used car salesman, he's going to tell you what you need to hear, but the end result is that everyone has the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's the pro-Paul argument, is they admit he has a dual identity. And they admit that his writings do not sound the same, and he seemingly contradicts himself, but it's innocent on his part. It's an asset because those simpletons in the desert, aka the original apostles, remember the church fathers, those simpletons in the desert would never know how to bring the word out to the pagans. Paul understood the pagans because he was a Roman citizen. He lived there his whole life. So he understood their mindset, their culture, their way of thinking, their Greek philosophy stuff. So he knew how to present Jesus Christ in the perfectly marketed way. So Paul was a marketer extraordinaire, but he didn't really teach anything wrong. He was just marketing. That's just Paul marketing to the pagans. And then when he's over here with the Jews, he doesn't have to do that marketing anymore. So like this proves that what Paul says over here, that Paul wasn't being deceptive over here. He was just marketing. That's the argument towards Paul. That's the scholarly arguments towards Paul, or the more intelligent of defenses towards Paul. I disagree. I disagree. And we'll get to why. When I figured this out and got this spirit of darkness that came upon me, it's because my friend was reading during Easter time. She was reading Acts. And I go, oh, I've been in the Old Testament so long. Let me move over and like read Acts. Let me get into Acts and like get a better picture. And as soon as I got through like 2 or 3 chapters and got to Saul, I went, oh, and like this spirit of just dark. You guys, it was supernatural. I can't explain it. It was just this spirit of alarming. Something's wrong was like into me, and it vexed me is the best way to describe it. I think I even made a face where Paul is vexing me. Like, what the world? It was a really weird feeling. Like a dark shadow came in, and I'm going, something's wrong here. and I started to unravel Paul. When I got to the point where he misquoted King David, interestingly, because I love King David, right? I went, whoa, 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 whoa. That's not what King David said. I love King David. Like, that's not what he said. So, and Paul does, I assert, misquote many things from the Old Testament. I wouldn't have caught them because they're subtle. I'd be like, yeah, that's what Isaiah said. But Paul's probably summarizing. Let's move on. And I might have noticed it. Like, that's not quite the right words. But you know what? Whatever, he's summarizing, right? He's a marketer. And I would have gone with that until he misquoted King David. And then I said, whoa, 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 wait. Not only is that not what King David said, that's not at all what King David meant. So the context in which Paul lifted this verse and assigned it back and quoted David and used it for a completely opposite purpose than David was, made me go, fuck this guy. Why is he doing that? And that led me to really crawl up Paul's ass. So thank you, King David. Thank you, King David. I love you. That's how I caught Paul. All right. And I wouldn't have if I didn't was so in love with King David and looking at all his shit really deeply and studying the history and the artifacts and what he said and why he said it and all that stuff. So thank you, King David. All right, let's keep going. Who is Saul? Well, the next part of Saul is his grandfather was a Sadducee and his father was a Pharisee. The Sadducees, essentially, for our purposes right now, there were differences. They weren't together. They fought each other a lot. So it wasn't like the Sadducees. Sometimes people think it's like a hierarchy, and it was. But they think the Sadducees were above the Pharisees, who are above the regular rabbi, who are above the people. No. The Sadducees and Pharisees were different. And yes, the Sadducees were more elite, but not necessarily directly over and in cooperation with the Pharisees. They had completely different sects of Judaism, if you will, but the way they functioned in society makes it seem more directly hierarchical, but it wasn't. They had different belief systems. So they were bitching and fighting with each other all the time too. The Sadducees were the most elite Hebrews, the people who were the Sadducees, because they were in conjunction and working right in communion with the Romans. So they were like your literal elites. We'd say today aristocracy, the elites, all the people with the secret handshakes doing shit that we are not invited to the meeting. That's the Sadducees. The Sadducees were in the meeting, okay, and working really hand in hand with government. The Sadducees also did not believe in an afterlife. They didn't believe in heaven and hell, and they did not believe that a Messiah was coming. So, is that even Jewish at this point? I don't know. Then you have the Pharisees. Now, the Pharisees did believe in an afterlife. They did believe in a Messiah to set up a new kingdom and rule and reign. But their idea of a new kingdom in their time was a political kingdom, not a spiritual kingdom. So all of their prophecies was they imagined this great military leader coming to lead them and throw off Rome and finally free them from all of these enemies and all of these baby eaters that have been around them from the beginning of time all the way back. Okay. All the way back, the road trip from hell, everything. They're going to just cast off everything. And he was going to be this mighty military and political leader to establish the kingdom. They couldn't imagine that the Messiah would come as God's kingdom and give them the power and authority over all things in a spiritual realm that can be brought down to the physical. They were only looking at physical. Okay. They also believe that something called the oral law and the written law were equal. Okay. And that God would judge people on all the law and all of your good works on earth, good deeds. Now, so there's the law of the Torah, right? Because we think of the law as 10 commandments. It's more than that. There's a lot more in Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, all this stuff. There's more law than just the 10 commandments. And it talks about, animal cruelty and who you can marry and who you can't marry and who you can fuck and, how to treat your neighbor, like whatever the heck it is that's in there, and all the controversial stuff. I can't say because it's on YouTube, but you get the idea. All of the more controversial stances. We are going to get to those when we return to Leviticus. And I'm going to explain to you why those are there and what they meant in the context of that time. But we are not touching that right now because we moved to Paul. Okay. But we'll get back there. I promise. I'm not afraid of those things. So there's that law. And the Pharisees were the ones who would stand around and argue about the moral law. And this is a cultural thing that you have to understand. Ancient Middle East Hebrew culture. I can compare it when I go to the Middle East, or you go to India. So if you've ever been to the Middle East or India, or if you can just imagine, you're in this marketplace, right? This happens in South America too. This happens in Mexico sometimes. I think it's Mexico too. I don't know. But they're haggling. Think of the concept of haggling, right? I would go to the market in Morocco, and I'm going to buy a scarf, a pashmina, and the guy is going to say, 24 Moroccan dollars. And I'm going to go, no, I'll give you 10. And then that process that takes place of coming onto a fair price is called haggling. That's not just something Americans see that as a pain in the ass. Like, we don't want to haggle, right? We just want to know what's the fucking price you're trying to rip me off. And we take offense to that in a really weird way. But that's our culture. That's not their culture. Their culture is it's a fun exchange, because it doesn't really fucking matter if you pay like $15 or $16. What matters is the fun and the goodwill of getting it from 25 and 10 to the middle place of 15 or 16. Does that make sense? No, sometimes they do try to rip you off, but usually it's just, it holds you there. And, people, it's great. And like, they used to chase me when I would finally go, no, you lose. I'm not doing this anymore. You're taking advantage of me because I'm a stupid blonde American and I know it. You're not haggling fairly. And I would walk off. They would chase me down the market and be like, wait, American girl, come back. Okay, come on. And then some guy would step up and he'd go, I'll step in. Look, give her the scarf. And me, I'll be the husband. So now you get a scarf and a husband for 20. And we would laugh, and then they'd give me coffee, and then they'd come down to 15 anyways. So haggling's a cultural phenomenon in many parts of the world. And it's not meant to be like a rip-off pain in the ass like Americans see it. And so the Pharisees, right, they were the keepers of the law. When you're working in the field and the ox is hungry, let the ox have a break and eat in the field, right? And the spirit of that law is basically, it doesn't have to do with specifically an ox. Like, if your cow's tired or your goat's tired, feed them, right? Doesn't matter that it's an ox. That was one little line. And they pull out that line and go, okay, so it's not just an ox. So now let's have an oral law of all of the things about which animals and what they eat and what makes them clean versus unclean and pure versus impure. And now let's expand that even further to kindness to all animals and how we treat animals in the environment, whether wild or domesticated. And now you've got this whole entire animal rights movement. And they're documenting all of their ideas that they're haggling with to determine what the law really is. So now their whole section of animal rights laws come from these Pharisees whose culture it is to meet in the square or meet in the temples and argue and debate and talk about, today we're going to talk about Leviticus law 536 that says, let the ox eat in the field. What does that mean? And then they all debate and drill it down and then write 300 things about animal rights. So there's their law, and then there's the commandments. Now, the law and the commandments also different things, but just know that was part of the culture. That Pharisee arguing law is the law that Jesus came back and was talking about when he said, fuck that. That's the law when God said, observe the Sabbath and keep it holy, right? In love, that's, if you look at it in love, that's the way of God loving you and saying, I rested, you too need rest. Rest, be with me. Get rid of all your other responsibilities and just be with your family and your neighbors and your friends and your loved ones. And have a nice meal with me and commune with me and like be together with me as the center and just remember me and let's have time together. That's what God meant. Learn about me, praise me, love me, have your loved ones around, have a beautiful meal with me. Let's take some time together. That's the spirit of keep the Sabbath. But that's because of their law, right, that they argued in their culture and drilled down on. That became these legalistic Pharisees coming after Jesus saying, how dare you heal a blind person on the Sabbath? That's breaking God's law. And Jesus is like, no, it isn't. No, it isn't. You don't understand God's law. Healing blind on the Sabbath is your law that you guys babbled about and put into place. And by the way, are using that to terrorize the people. That's not God's law. God's law is like, of course I can heal somebody on the Sabbath, dumbass. Like, so that's where that whole conflict with Jesus and the Pharisees came in, as to what was God's law versus the Pharisee law. Okay, so we've got those worked out. So his grandfather was a Sadducee and his dad was the Pharisee. So Paul's got both of those in his line, plus he's from the tribe of Benjamin and named after Saul, the asshole who fucked with King David. So far, Paul's not a great guy. He studied under a very famous Pharisee named, no, I can't look at the name. If I look at the name, I can't say the name. It's Gamaliel, whatever the fuck. Gamaliel, he studied under. And this guy was a famous Pharisee because he was like a great thinker. And I'm not going to put him on this level of like Socrates or Plato. Like, don't think he was that same famousness. But among the Jewish Hebrew community, he was pretty famous because he was saying his whole shtick, if you will, that he would talk about as a Pharisee and argue about in the temples and do the his basis or his lens, his framework for arguing the law, if you will, was all about how Hebrew law is applicable to today's Greco-Roman, Athenian, modern Hebrew society. So like, no, we're not shepherds running around with Moses, in the middle of the desert anymore. Now we've got these big cosmopolitan cities and all of this art where society is changing and we're much more modernized. So how do the Moses stuff apply today? And so that was kind of his lens. So he was pretty famous and extremely well revered and well respected. This Gamaliel guy eventually voted Paul to sit in the Sanhedrin. Now, the Sanhedrin is not a Sadducee thing. They both start with S. Sanhedrin is the tippy top of the priesthood of the Pharisees. So I want you to think of, you've got I need you to think of the Catholics right now, because they kind of do this. And it's like you've got your priest, which is your Pharisees. Then you've got your bishop, who's like, over these giant mega conglomerate regions of earth. So there's like a bishop over this whole area of the East Coast, or there's this bishop over this whole area of like the Southeast. And all of these churches report up to them. That's sort of the Sanhedrin, but the Sanhedrin, I think, is even bigger than that, but that gives you an idea. So the Sanhedrin was this like court of people who made final rulings on the down here. They'd send it up to Sanhedrin was like the Supreme Court of Pharisees, if you will. Okay. So this Gamaliel guy is friends with Paul's dad. So he went to study under him. Then he eventually voted that Paul be one of these high up Sanhedrin guys. And that's the point where he starts the run-in with the apostles. So this was some guy, okay? This was a very prominent, wealthy guy with all of this background. When he gets to the Sanhedrin, now remember when he went down to study with Gamaliel, he was studying in Jerusalem area, and then he went back home to Tarsus up in Turkey. Then he was called for to come back down a few years later and join the Sanhedrin of this Supreme Court-y people. When he came back down, that's when he started to hear rumblings of this lunatic who claims to be the Messiah, who's doing miracles and rabble rousing and speaking against the Pharisees and speaking against their law and causing all of this problems. And this crazy dude from Nazarenes riling people up and going against the law and the Pharisees. This is where he learns of him. He wasn't a Pharisee. He was a Sanhedrin Pharisee, which means he has more authority to do the arrests and persecutions. So this is when Paul begins to persecute the followers of Jesus and, arresting them and yada, 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 yada. So he's working, arresting them. And the Sadducees are working with the governments, with the Roman secular government, and also they're the head of because they're the head of the religious government of the Pharisees, working together to do all of this law enacting. Okay, there it is. This persecution eventually led to the stoning of Stephen. And I'm purposefully not getting into the stoning of Stephen, but we'll talk about that another time. We'll study that another time. But it led to him being the ringleader when they stoned Stephen, and everybody laid their coats at his feet, right? Their Pharisee coats at Paul's feet when Stephen was stoned. So he gets on the road to Damascus. And the reason he was on the road to Damascus is north in Syria. So he's leaving Jerusalem. It's about a 4-day walk. And he's leaving Jerusalem to go to Damascus. And the reason he is to get these court papers delivered so he could go and arrest more Christians. So he's basically obtaining warrants, okay, and spreading warrants around to say, look, I got these warrants. We're going in again and kicking down doors for these people. And, arresting every fucking body. Men, women, children didn't care. They're just arresting everybody. So that's what Paul's on the way to do. And that's when the famous Damascus Road vision, I'm not going to call it a vision. He doesn't call it a vision. That's important in this case. I have to be more careful with my words. This is when this is when Jesus came to him on the road of Damascus, allegedly. Okay? That's the context. He claimed to see Jesus on the road to Damascus and was converted. Now he's a believing Christian. Overnight, just like that, boom. And then he went on to plant churches all across the Roman Empire, and he preached a mystery gospel. And Paul will tell you that. I'm preaching a mystery gospel that was just revealed to me by Jesus that those other apostles don't know about. It's just me. I got the secret handshake gospel. So he starts doing that, and he says that very openly. Paul had an end times apocalyptic view. He believed they were in the end times. Remember, we talked about that with the Pharisees. And he was a self-admitted and historical Herodian. Well, what the world does that mean? I'm not tell you. Paul was a Herodian. Paul was a Herodian. So let's take a break and let's talk about who's Herod. Saul the Herodian, the bloodline of lunatics. All right. We've got Herod the Great. I could talk for hours, hours on Herod and the Herodian bloodline, but I'm not. I relate the Herod dynasty. This is a dynasty of kings ruling Jerusalem under the ultimate authority of Rome. Okay, so they're in the Roman Empire. These aren't Roman Caesars. But the Caesars, the Roman Caesars, had something called, well, hold on. I'm getting ahead of myself. All right. So he's the bloodline of King Herod. They're part of the Herodian dynasty and lineage and DNA and bloodline. And he actually has allegiance. And Paul has stated out of his mouth, I have allegiance to the Herodian dynasty. Now that ruled from about 37 to 4 BC was King Herod. Okay. His sons carried it on after that in Jesus's time. But Herod himself was right around 37 to 4. And then he had a bunch of sons, and then the sons were lunatics, and they all took over. But Paul himself, this whole dynasty of king and sons, is what Paul pledged allegiance to in his own words. In his own words. Some can argue, well, he didn't really mean that. He was just saying that for a political expedience at the time so that he could keep on going and, preaching the gospel without getting in trouble. He said it with his own words. We're just going to leave that, and we'll get to that later. But as the Roman Empire was spreading and spreading and spreading, and your Caesars couldn't keep control of every single place in every single area, so King Herod really ruled the areas in Jerusalem called Judea and Galilee, and then he kind of like broke off later. There were 3 areas in Israel at the time. It was Galilee, Samaria, and Judea, or Judah. That was a name change, but same thing. It just shows you what period in time. Was it called Judah or was it called Judea? And it gives you sort of an idea of where to place the timeline, but same place. The King Herod is the same King Herod that ordered when the 3 wise men came and Jesus was born, and then King Herod sent for the wise men and says, how did you know? Why are you worshiping him, bringing frankincense? He's the king. Tell us how you found him, which is a whole nother thing that goes into the Maseroth and the stars and the astrology that was there at the time that got corrupted today. But that's for another time. And the Holy Spirit came to them and says, no, don't tell this guy the secret of how you found that he was the king, because this guy's a bad guy. So they didn't tell him. And instead, they went to Jesus's family and said, Mary, Joseph, you guys got to split. Like, do not return to the place that's to Galilee, this place where Galilee, Samaria, Judea, right? He was in charge. Don't go back to being under his charge. You've got to leave and go someplace else. And so that's the flight of the Holy Family. This is King Herod. And then King Herod didn't care. He came and slaughtered all the babies 2 years and under, because it said that there's some dating on this that's going on right now historically, but the scholars are looking at, they think Jesus was almost 2 historically when this took place, which is why the order was 2 and under and not just newborns, that he actually had grown to the age of about almost 2 when Herod gave that decree. And they're digging archaeologically in that through history to verify that date. But that's the King Herod, the bloody one who killed everybody's kids. Fucking lunatic. After he dies off in 4 BC, right? He leaves his lineage to all of these sons of his. All right. Now, he was called King of the Jews, which is interesting to me because that was Herod's nickname, was King of the Jews. And what did they hang on the cross over Jesus's head? Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. It was a mockery of him. So it's interesting that comes from the bloodline of Herod, and that phrase comes from Herod, and then was put over Christ's head as a mockery. That King of the Jews, like it was a straight up mockery, and that's from the Herodian bloodline, of which Paul pledged allegiance to. Okay, do I even need to continue my presentation? Yes, I do. Yes, I do. All right. Because everything I say can be thus far, everything I've said thus far would be dismissed by any good church-going Christian or pastor. And here's how they dismiss it. Ready? Here's their answer. You don't believe in the power of Jesus Christ. You don't believe in the power of God to transform even the worst of sinners. And this is why Paul is so loved, because Paul speaks to their hearts and their emotions, not their logic, their emotions. It speaks to the emotional connection of God can do anything, even build a church from this asshole. It just shows the power of conversion and the power of what happens when you're born again and the Holy Spirit comes involved and you're completely transformed, like Paul. Like, you can't get worse than Paul. I don't really even know if there's any biblical figures. I mean, there are. I don't know if there's any so-called redeemed figures that are as evil as Paul was. We have evil figures, but they never got redeemed. Paul is like the redeemed of the redeemed. It's almost as if Christians are claiming that the power of God saved Satan himself. That's how bad Paul was. Okay, but I digress. So I'm not going to stop here because their emotions say, well, that's the power of God. So you need to believe and go repent. But I'm not speaking from emotion. I'm speaking from study. And that's where I'm going to take you. That would be a great story. I'd love that story. It's not the one I go with because I researched it. I read Jesus. I listen to King Jesus. That's why.